Hello and welcome to the Signpost interview as part of the first Signpost General Assembly, which is taking place today and tomorrow. Tonight we're going to be looking at the steps we need to take to reach agriculture's targets for cutting greenhouse gas emissions. We'll be talking to Teagasc Director Frank O'Mara and the head of the Signpost Programme, Tom O'Dwyer. And I won't be the only one doing the interview. Every one of you tuning in tonight will have an opportunity to put questions to our panellists. At the bottom of your screen there is a Q&A box. If you type your question into that, give us your name, press send, and we'll do our best to get through as many of those questions as possible. Frank, as we saw there in the opening video, very ambitious targets have been set, 22 to 30% by 2030. Ambitious, are they realistic?
Look, Helen, good evening everybody, and look, you're right, they are very, very ambitious targets. But look, I suppose we are dealing with a very, very significant problem facing not just Ireland but facing the world, that the issue of climate change. And it is going to require a massive change in the way the world operates and in terms of how we live our lives and what we do. And you know, a lot of that is around fossil fuel and taking fossil fuels out of the picture. So bringing it back home here to Ireland, and yes, our government has set a very ambitious target to reduce national emissions by 51% by 2030. And 2030 might sound a long way away, but like it's only 8 or 9 years. So to have our emissions over that period is a really significant challenge. And you know, agriculture is one of the sectors that produces emissions, but it's not the only one. Transport, obviously, the cars we all drive, the lorries, the trains and so on, that's a big source of emissions. And obviously electricity generation is another very big source and so on. And all those sectors are going to have to change radically. So with an overall reduction of 51%, each sector has been assigned a different target. First of all, the Climate Change Advisory Council gave its report to government, and then government has proposed different targets for different sectors. And for instance, the electricity target is up towards an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Agriculture's target is to reduce emissions by between 22 and 30%. It's the lowest of any of the sectors. Now that's not because agriculture somehow or other got off light. It's because everybody recognises it's actually very, very difficult to reduce emissions from agriculture while you maintain food production. And also it was in recognition to the very big impact that having to cut the national herd would have on the economy of rural areas. So the target of 22 to 30%, we've looked at it. We think it's very demanding but achievable. And it's achievable if we I guess take it in stages. We think if we apply the technologies we already know about and improve the efficiencies on our farms, that's the first step. We have another set of technologies that are, we're currently researching that are nearly ready to be, I suppose, proposed to farmers for adoption. So when we bring that to fruition and start adopting those technologies, that's the second step. That won't get us all the way to this 22 to 30%. We'll still have a distance to travel, and I suppose the solution we see there is some early stage technologies that we're working at, like breeding animals that produce less methane, or using feed additives that could be used at pasture. If that research is successful and can be applied on farms, we think we can get to this target. So quite challenging, but I suppose our proposition is that we can reach those targets through efficiency and technology without a need to cut the national herd, which would have a very serious impact on farmers' livelihoods and on rural communities.
You sound quietly confident to me, Frank. Are you fairly confident then that...
Well, look, I can see a pathway, I suppose. You know what I mean? If I couldn't see the end point of the journey, I'd be saying that. But I can see that if we can develop the technologies and apply the technologies that we already have and the ones we'll be developing, and I suppose support farmers in terms of using those technologies, yes, we can get there. And I think it'll be fantastic for the agriculture sector to be able to show that progress and to be able to show progress in the right direction fairly soon. And I suppose bring the rest of society with us and have our countrymen and women say, congratulating agriculture for the progress it is making, I suppose, rather than, as is happening now to some extent, some commentators pointing the finger and wagging the finger at agriculture. I think we need to turn that narrative around, and the sooner we can do it, the better. And that's why I think this programme is actually very, very important in that regard.
And Tom, with the Signpost Programme, I presume it was designed with a view to travelling along that pathway to meeting the reductions that are required of Irish agriculture. So is the Signpost Programme a big part of it?
Yes, indeed. When Teagasc published its list of technologies that could help farmers to reduce emissions, one of the recommendations in that report was that there was a need for a significant knowledge transfer and education support program to help farmers to adopt the technologies to change their farming practices so that they could reduce emissions. So the Signpost Programme idea sprung from that. And a number of us within Teagasc got together and we started to contact potential industry partners to see if they'd join with us. And that's another big part of the Signpost Programme, that Teagasc is not taking this initiative all on its own. It's a whole of industry initiative led by Teagasc with the key aim of supporting farmers to adopt the efficiencies and the technologies that Frank has referred to in his earlier answer.
So the guts of 100 farmers have signed up to this, and there's a geographical spread, and it's all different types of enterprises. Were you looking for farmers who were already taking steps in that direction anyway? I mean, are most of the farmers who've signed up farmers who were working at reducing their emissions?
I don't think they were all working at reducing their emissions when we engaged them initially, but they all had an interest in learning more and finding out how they could future-proof their farms in the face of the types of challenge that Frank referred to. So that they could see the direction their farm was going to take, and they were willing to put themselves forward as demonstration farmers. And I think I want to take this opportunity to compliment them, because it's not easy to put your hand up and say, yes, I'll be part of a program where I'm going to work very closely with an advisor, I'm going to make changes, and not alone am I going to make changes, but I'm going to allow Teagasc to monitor and measure what's happening on my farm, and then to use that information in advisory and education and training programs with other farmers, so to influence other farmers. So I think it's quite interesting that farmers recognise that and are willing to do that. And we have a very strong a history of that within Teagasc. We've worked with demonstration farmers over 25 to 30 years at this stage, as far as I can remember, and perhaps even before that. And it's well proven that having a demonstration farmer in the area to talk with his neighbouring farmers, his peer farmers, it's a very powerful way of influencing a lot of other farmers. So that's why we've put the demonstration farmers at the centre of our Signpost programme, but equally we want to engage all farmers through the Signpost programme. It's not just about the 100 odd farmers that we've signed up as the demonstration farmers. They're a very important part of it, but I want to be able to talk to you in a number of years' time and say, yes, we've engaged with a very large number of farmers.
Well, now is probably the ideal time to introduce you to a couple of our Signpost farmers. We visited a few farms over the last few weeks, and first we're going to introduce you to a farmer from Meath and a farmer from Roscommon who've signed up to the Signpost programme.
My name is Aidan Maguire. I'm farming here in Navan, County Meath with my son Luke. We run a calf to beef system. We bring calves from 3 weeks of age to slaughter at 20 to 24 months, both heifers and bullocks. I'm one of over 100 farmers involved in this programme, and I'm hoping to achieve at the end of it to be a profitable operation that's operating sustainably and environmentally and making full use of modern technology to get there. The biggest challenges I see is maintaining profitability with rising input costs of feed and fertilizer, and also the beef price volatility. I've started buying my calves from a very limited source of farmers in the local area. I've introduced a herd health plan where I vaccinate all the calves. I've improved my grassland management by measuring grass on a weekly basis, and I use low emission slurry spreading and protected urea. And I've also introduced red clover to the sward as well.
My name is Cathal McHugh. I'm farming here in a farm partnership with my father Des, just outside Strokestown in County Roscommon. Started milking in 2014 and milked 110 cows this year gone by, and milking on a fairly dry farm. I find the biggest challenge to my farm here coming down the track is the proposed legislation on greenhouse gas emissions and water quality. At the end of the 5-year Signpost programme, I would like to improve the nitrogen efficiency on the farm by reducing chemical fertilizer use.
that there one of the main concerns, and it's a concern that's shared by a lot of farmers, is how to maintain profitability while reducing your emissions on the farm, and can it be done?
Well, look, it has to be done, I suppose. You know, for us, sustainability is a very holistic concept encompassing economic sustainability, which is first and foremost, I suppose, in the minds of farmers, as you'd expect, environmental sustainability and social sustainability. And while the Signpost Programme was set up in response to the climate issue, we very much recognise that, you know, you have to watch the bottom line, the economic side of it as well. So look, I suppose a lot of the technologies that we would see, they're around improving efficiency, and you know, they may not really cost much extra to implement. So the job is around educating farmers about them and maybe supporting them in the implementation of something like clover, which clover will save you money. You know what I mean? You can reduce your fertilizer purchases by incorporating clover into your farm. But it does take a lot of I suppose skilling or upskilling in terms of how to manage a clover sward. So that's our job, to be there to support farmers in that learning process, and hopefully be able to deliver then cost savings, which are going to be particularly important in 2022 with the price of fertilizers that we're going to be faced, but also deliver a benefit for the environment.
And the price of fertilizers, again, it's something that was mentioned in that story, Tom. You'd imagine if farmers are paying record highs for fertilizers at the moment, surely that in itself would be an incentive for a farmer to cut back on fertilizer use.
Absolutely, and we're already hearing from farmers that, you know, they're actively looking at maybe the value that they can get from their slurry, or what they can do next year maybe to reduce their fertilizer use. And yeah, you know, historically fertilizer has been relatively cheap, with two notable exceptions. I guess in 2008 going into 2009 there was a spike in prices, and again now this year we have a very significant spike in prices. And also there's the issue of availability. You know, we're hearing from farmers that even if they want to get fertilizer, it can be hard got. So I think farmers are going to have to be are going to have to plan ahead for 2022 in terms of their fertilizer and slurry use strategy. And interestingly, tomorrow morning, I'll get the plug in now, we have our webinar tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock that's going to deal exclusively with that issue.
It's something we've seen, I've seen it myself, particularly in the last couple of years, travelling around the country with ear to the ground, is how many farmers are embracing the use of clover, as we saw the Signpost farmer mentioned there, and multi-species swards and things like that. But there still seems to be a reluctance among some farmers, I suppose, to make that change. Why is that?
Well, look, if I could maybe come in there, and first of all, maybe just to deal with the fertilizer, I suppose, look, there's a saying that you never waste a good crisis. And I suppose for farmers, I would say, look, next year is going to be an expensive year with inputs, and we're all going to be or when I say we, I mean farmers, advisors, researchers, going to be trying to find ways to reduce those fertilizer bills, and make better use of organic manure, make best use of whatever fertilizer we have to buy. And whatever we learn next year with that, we should retain that for the future when hopefully fertilizer prices come down. So just because fertilizer gets cheaper doesn't mean we should lash on more of it. We should use the learnings from next year as a way of long-term cost saving, but also long-term reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of why farmers might be reluctant to adopt technologies, look, we're all, I suppose, slow to change in our habits and in the way we're doing things, whether it's the way I come into work every day, how I tackle my day's work for the day, and if someone says there's a better way to do that, Frank, but I'm probably slow enough to go about changing that. So it's a big ask of people to actually ask them to turn around and change their system. Maybe someone that's, you know, producing cattle at 24 to 26 months of age to start to say, well, look, could you get those down and sell some of them at 18 to 20 months of age? Like, you know, if you're in a system that's working for you, you know, you probably like to do that as best you can rather than change the system. So look, that's one thing, but there is an education, I suppose, element then as well in terms of learning maybe new skills around clover, as I mentioned, or whatever. And I suppose that's where we have a role to support farmers in relation to that. I don't know whether Tom would like to add to that.
Yeah, just it strikes me that Seamus Carney, the Signpost training specialist, and I were co-delivering a training course last week, and we asked farmers some of the challenges that they face in terms of taking climate action. And one of the responses that came back to us quite frequently was where to start. So the climate change challenge, as referred to Frank previously, is such an enormous challenge for everybody in the world, for everybody in Ireland. And for farmers, there's a variety of ways in which they can reduce their emissions. But where to start? What's the first step that should be taken? And I think, and we hear it from plenty of our farming partners when we're talking to them, farmers are very committed to taking the necessary steps. And what they ask us for, just will you give us the guidance, advise us what we should start with. So I suppose that's a key job of the Signpost Programme, to provide that guidance and then to support farmers as they take those first steps.
Have you set targets for each of the individual farmers who are taking part in this programme?
Yes, the advisors who are supporting the 100-odd signpost farmers this autumn have sat down with individual signpost farmers and created a tailored farm sustainability plan for the specific signpost farmer and his or her farm. And what we focused on there is to identify where the farm is at in terms of the actions and the technologies and the efficiencies that we've referred to previously in the conversation. Not necessarily on measuring what the footprint is. That can come later. But our starting point was, whether the farm had clover or not, whether the farmer was using low emission slurry spreading or not, or whether the farmer was using protected urea or not. And having established that then in a conversation with the farmer to try and establish, well, what could you achieve in the next 12 months? What steps? What are the first steps that you could take? And they might be relatively minor for some farmers. And to go back then to your earlier question about whether we were looking for farmers that had already adopted the technologies. If we found in that conversation about the plan for the future development of the farm that the farmer was already using low emission slurry spreading, we would say, look, well done. You're already using one of the technologies. We don't need to focus on that one as a technology, but there's another list of technologies that you can choose from. So maybe for that farmer, it's to pay attention to clover. Whereas for another farmer in the Signpost Programme, it might be you start with the low emission slurry spreading. So there is a tailored solution available for each farmer. And I suppose the challenge, I guess, for Teagasc and our partners is to try and ensure that we get to talk with individual farmers and to try and establish what's best for the individual farmer and what that farmer what action that farmer is able to take on.
Frank?
I might just say as well, look, this is not a Teagasc plan then that a farmer ends up with. This is his or her own plan. And okay, we're there to help them figure out what choices and what changes they can make. But I think, it has to have ownership from the people that control and own or operate the farms. And look, I think for all of us in our lives, in terms of how we might address how we impact on climate change, we have to, I suppose, make the decision, first of all, that we want to do it, and then figure out what we can do, and then go away and do it. So it's very much rests with the farmer, and we're there as agents of support.
I've heard you describe it in the past, Tom, as a living lab almost. That's the ideal way you'd like these farms to work. So it's almost the kind of real world use of a lot of these mitigation measures. It's very early days. Is it far too early for you to give us any idea of how things are going on the Signpost farms?
Well, if you were talking to me, I suppose, in maybe around February, March next year, I probably would have some figures, but we're currently gathering data on the farms. 2021 is our baseline year. So we will have a baseline for all the farms in early 2022, Helen. And from that then, we'll be able to track progress over future years.
Okay. I suppose one thing that I've noticed that in a way the Signpost farmers are lucky in that they are being tracked and what they're doing, the impact of the measures they're taking on their farms is being recorded. So they can almost get kind of scientific validation that what they're doing is working. But there's an awful lot of farmers around the country who are taking similar measures, whether it's multi-species swords, clover, cutting down on the amount of fertilizer they're using and things like that. But I've spoken to farmers who'd say, I know it's having some impact, but I'd love to know how much of an impact. I'd love to know, have I reduced my emissions by what percentage? Is there any way that there'll be some kind of a self-assessment tool brought in through this programme for farmers who aren't lucky enough to be signpost farmers to see the impact? Because I think almost that encourages you more. If you see that your emissions are going down, you'll keep at it even more. So is there any plan for something like that in the future?
Yeah.
Well, I suppose I can start that. I can say that currently for farmers who are participating in the Sustainable Dairy Assurance Schemes with Board BIA, as part of the Farmer Sustainability Survey, each farmer receives a feedback report for his or her farm. And on that, based on the information provided by the farmer at the audit, they receive a carbon footprint figure on a per kilo of milk basis or per kilo of meat basis, depending on whether they're dairy or beef. And also now recently for dairy farmers, they're receiving a figure on a per hectare basis. So for 54,000 farmers who are participating with Bord Bia in the Sustainable Dairy Assurance Schemes, they are receiving those figures at the moment. Now, the accuracy of those figures will depend on the information provided by the farmer. And in our conversations with farmers this autumn, and Bord Bia are a partner in the Signpost Programme, and we jointly delivered a campaign this autumn to focus in on raising the awareness around those reports with farmers. And we got very, very good feedback from farmers on our efforts in that area. And I suppose, what we found was that once farmers realised that those reports were there, they were going to look for them, and they were also going to ensure that the reports were accurate. So they were actually going back to Bord Bia, some small number were going back and say, look, I need to just make sure that the figures are correct. So I think you are correct. Once the figures are available, farmers will use them.
I think now is as good a time as any. We might go to our second video of the Signpost farm. I think it was travelling down to Wexford to meet a tillage farmer. We might take a look at this.
My name is Don Summers. I'm a tillage farmer from County Wexford. We grow winter and spring cereals on our farm, winter wheat, winter barley, winter oats and winter oilseed rape, as well as spring barley and spring beans. The things I'm doing on my farm to reduce greenhouse gas emissions are importing organic fertilizers like chicken litter, farmyard manure and dairy sludge as a substitute for chemical fertilizer. We cover crop all our spring sown area, and we also main-till and are trying some direct drilling on our farm. Through the Signpost Programme, I'm hoping to measure the contribution that my farm and tillage farming can make to reducing greenhouse gas emissions through measures such as yield mapping and variable rate application of fertilizers, through the use of organic fertilizers, through the use of cover cropping and different establishment methods.
Tillage farming wouldn't have the biggest footprint of the farming enterprises going on in Ireland, but obviously even at that level, there's a difference that they can make. There's steps tillage farmers can take.
Absolutely, yeah. Look, tillage farming has much lower emissions per hectare than livestock farming. That's absolutely true. But as we've seen, we can save emissions by reducing fertilizer, by maybe using organic manures or through precision application of fertilizers. Maybe look at trying to save fuel use by min-till or other lesser cultivation methods and so on. So look, I think the point about these targets is that everybody can do something, and probably everybody needs to do something for agriculture to reach those targets. It is very much a collective effort. And you were talking a minute ago about individual farmers wanting to know what their position was. And look, I think that's really true. I think we all like to know how we're performing, even if it's only when we're out for a walk. Did we do it in 33 minutes this week or 33 minutes, or did we get it down to 32 minutes or whatever? We all like to measure and monitor our performance. So as Tom said, we through the Bord Bia carbon audits, that's actually available to a lot of farmers. We are, I suppose, going to develop a kind of a what-if tool as well. You know what I mean? It's one thing to know what you're doing, but you might also like to be able to say, well, if I adopted protected urea, or if I put in clover and reduce my fertilizer by 100 kilograms per hectare, well then what would that do to my farm emissions? So we want a tool like that I suppose our advisors can use with farmers when they're out having that discussion with farmers and trying, I suppose, chart out the progress that can be made.
If we look at it, some of the farmers who are using all available tools and technologies and doing everything the way it should be done are maybe at most managing to cut emissions by 15%, which is laudable, obviously. But if we're asking them to double that within the next few years, it does mean they need new tools and new technologies, don't they?
Absolutely, and look, that's what we said. We kind of see three steps: the what we can apply now, the technologies that are nearly ready, and the ones that are going to take a good bit more work before they are ready. And I suppose, look, some of the type of things that are coming in the basket of nearly ready to use technologies are, for instance, a thing that's talked about quite a bit now earlier, slaughter of beef cattle. Now that sounds very simple. Look, you know, the average age at slaughter of bullocks is 27 months. Let's reduce that to 24 months and hey presto, we save a lot of emissions. It's actually a lot harder to do on the ground in a way that won't impact on the profitability of the system or won't flood the market at a particular time and so on. So look, we will be working with our beef specialists to identify where the opportunities might be to do that in a sensible way. We also have things like feed additives, and you know, there's lots of research going on around the world and in Ireland on seaweeds, on essential oils, on various products that might reduce emissions. And I suppose, you know, there is some very promising research on feed additives now, particular compounds that will reduce the amount of methane that an animal belches out. And look, we see there will be a role for those, and I suppose so. But it is going to take new technologies like that to bring us the last steps of the journey.
And I heard you mention in an interview about, even when it comes to I suppose genetics and the breeds of animals, you were talking about even research into an animal itself that emits less methane.
That's right, yeah. And look, there's two ways that genetics can contribute here. There's one by just making more efficient animals, and an animal that just grows more efficiently or whatever is going to get to its target weight at a younger age, and therefore has less lifetime emissions. So and better fertility in cows and so on. It means you need less cows to give you your crop of calves. So breeding for efficiency is very important. But can you breed for actually animals that produce less methane than another animal, even though they're eating the same amount? And you know, we have research now. We had some research published there a fortnight ago that showed, yes, animals eating the same amount on the same diet, eating the same amount of it, some of them produce less emissions. So there is genetic variability there. So this is something we can go after in breeding programs, and that's going to be a very active area of research for us over the coming years.
And as regards the active area of research, Tom, are you trialling some of, or Teagasc trialling some of the, I suppose, some of your research on these signpost farms?
So the key research that's kind of taking place on the signpost farms now at the moment is into the whole area of soil carbon, and the project is called the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory. It's led by my colleague in Johnstown Castle, Gary Lanigan. And what we're trying to establish there is the amount of carbon that's stored in our soils under different farming systems, so dairy, beef, sheep, tillage and so on, at different levels of intensity and different soil types, so mineral soils, peat soils and so on. So over the course of 4 to 5 years, we hope to build up data from the signpost farms that will feed into that research programme, and at the end of that period to have a more definite estimate of the amount of carbon stored in our soils on these farms, and to use that then subsequently to model the amount of carbon stored on other farms. So that's the key research experiment that's ongoing on our farms. But we'll also be looking at rolling out the technologies that we've previously referred to, and we will be looking to try and, I suppose, to capture the lessons from farmers as they are using those technologies. And by capturing those lessons, you know, what worked well, what didn't work so well, we can perhaps tailor our messages as we make those technologies available to more farmers.
Great, okay. I think now is as good a time to go to our third video. We're going to counties Cork and Leitrim to meet 2 more signpost farmers.
Hello, my name is Kay O'Sullivan, organic farmer from Mournebbie near Mallow in County Cork. The main enterprises here are suckler to beef, sheep, lambs and tillage for my own use.
I farm 100 acres here in Mournebbie, 25 cows and 85 ewes, and also approximately 25 acres of forestry.
The biggest challenge I see facing me here to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, as I'm already an organic farmer for the last 12 years, I'm already implementing a lot of the actions on the farm. I don't feed any meal, I don't use any fertilizer or any sprays, and I am using low emission slurry spreading on the farm. As part of the Signpost Future Beef Programme, I'm looking forward to doing out a farm plan here for my farm and implementing the changes accordingly. I'm further, looking forward to improving the breed of my cattle here on the farm.
My name is John O'Connell. I'm based here in Ballinamore in County Leitrim. I have 220 ewes mid-season lambing flock, and I also have a contract rearing dairy enterprise. One of the challenges is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and I hope to introduce more clover into the sward, and in return during the summer months maybe to be able to reduce my chemical nitrogen usage. One of the aims as a participant in the Signpost Programme is to be able to implement the measures going forward with climate change, and maybe to showcase those measures, what I have done to other farmers in the area.
Organic farmer there, and obviously a big part of reducing emissions at the moment seems to be encouraging more farmers to convert to organics. But is there a danger that we might flood the market with organic produce, and finding a market for it will be all the more difficult?
Yeah, look, that's a really good question. And we started maybe at the European Farm to Fork strategy that came out, I think, 2 years ago now at this stage, and that proposed, you know, that we'd increase the organic production yield up to 2% area. Here in Ireland, we're at around 2% or slightly less than 2% of our land in organic production now, and our government in its programme for government has suggested, or not suggested, has a target of increasing that to 7.5%. And we see a lot more money set aside in the rural development plan to allow that to happen, to allow a lot of farmers get into organics. And I suppose that is one of the concerns, I think, that everybody, existing farmers, potential new entrants, people like ourselves, Borbia, have is, you know, can we grow organics kind of at that rate and at that extent, and still have markets for our produce, for our organic produce? Because there's nothing, I think, that would disappoint people that get into organics more than going to the trouble of doing that and finding they're selling their produce then into the conventional market. And I'm sure existing organic farmers would also be very disappointed if that was the outcome. So look, it is something that I think is going to have to be very, very carefully factored in to the whole growth of organics here, is that issue of making sure that we have markets for that produce.
As you were saying, there's more to sustainability, financial sustainability, obviously.
Absolutely,
something that's hugely important as well. We've got some questions coming in. I suppose I'll put this one to you, Tom, first. A question from Ger. How will you know that Signpost is making progress? And I suppose, when will you know that Signpost is making progress?
Okay, so as I said earlier, we're going to take the baseline of the 100 odd Signpost farmers in 2021. So we'll have that as our starting point. And then every year thereafter, we'll repeat the data gathering and the data analysis process. So we will track the progress made by the Signpost farmers on a number of key performance indicators. So I suppose that's for the 100 odd Signpost farmers. So we'll have very detailed measurements on those farms, and we'll make all those available by way of our annual reports and farm walks and so on and so forth. I suppose a second way of whether we'll know whether we're making progress in the Signpost Programme or not, I guess, is the annual EPA report in terms of the overall emissions from the Irish economy. And within that, we'll be paying very close attention, I guess, to the total level of agricultural emissions, and whether that begins to trend in the right direction. As Frank said, you know, in earlier on in the discussion, there's a target to reduce agricultural emissions by between 22 and 30%. So we know the target, and you know, you can plot a line from where we are currently to where we need to get to in 2030, and we're either going to be, you know, on track there or not. Now, as it's not, you know, we don't want to claim that the Signpost Programme is going to be the only thing that will shift farming practices in the next decade, but certainly we will be keeping an eye on that, because you know, as I said earlier, we want to engage all farmers, and if all farmers are engaging in the activities of the Signpost Programme, we should see a change in the overall emissions from Irish agriculture.
Actually, you've kind of almost answered the next question then that came through from Carroll, which is, what about all the other farmers, the ones who aren't the 100 odd Signpost farmers? So I suppose it's the rising tide lifts all boats, then it's the...
Well, I think it's maybe just a little bit more than that. You know, we're actively committed through the Signpost Programme to mobilising all our own advisors and also the advisors of our partner organisations to work with farmers to support them in making the changes that are required. And what will that look like, Helen? Well, I suppose it'll look like Teagasc prioritising sustainability in all of its programmes and ensuring that our advisors are ready and equipped and enabled to help farmers, to talk with farmers about what changes they can make on their farms that will maintain productivity, maintain profitability, but will reduce the environmental footprint. And a term I like, will lighten the farm's load on the environment. So, you know, we're already have started that process within Teagasc, and we're going to work with our partner organisations to ensure that they too are in a position to put their shoulder to the wheel.
Frank, you want to come in on that?
Yeah, it's a very good question from Carroll. And look, for me, the success of the Signpost Programme will not be how well the 100 farmers do. You know, we know that they're by and large committed to trying to make progress on their farms. The success will be measured by how well the overall agriculture sector is dealing with this issue, because the Signpost farms, the demonstration farms, are kind of like the bridgehead for hopefully action by over 100,000 other Irish farmers. So you know, it's the tool we're using, or the approach we're taking, is to have these 100 demo farms around the country, in the hope that by us mobilising our advisors, the co-ops, other people's advisors, all the processors, I suppose, supporting their suppliers, that yes, we can encourage and extol all farmers to actually make progress and see those national figures coming down.
Well, Pádraig is asking you to contemplate the worst case scenario here. A question: what happens if there's no reduction in agricultural emissions?
Yeah, and look, that's another very good question. And I suppose over the last couple of months, when the targets, the national targets, were being debated in the press, there was lots of people saying, look, you know, this is it now, we've reached the point, we have to cut the national herd, we have these targets, the game is up, have to go cut the national herd. And I suppose our answer has been that no, actually, there is a way to reach these targets through efficiency and technology. Let's go down that pathway than the kind of, you know, last doomsday option of having to cut the national herd by diktat. So that's the approach, and I suppose that's why it's important that all of industry are you know, involved in this programme and see that as the pathway for agriculture as well, which they obviously do. I suppose the mechanics actually of how the climate bill works now is that you know, these targets are set in legislation. This is no longer kind of an aspirational target, and in a couple of months' time the Dáil will vote on these targets and they'll be signed into law. And look, as I understand it, the ministers responsible will be accountable just in the same way now that they get an allocation of money each year to their department and are responsible for, you know, keeping within that budget. Now they'll also have a responsibility to ensure that the sector that they're responsible for is living within its carbon budget. And I suppose, you know, the pressure will be on to take corrective action if it's seen that any sector is off course. And that's not just agriculture. Like, you know, if the electricity sector isn't seen to be, you know, delivering on its emission reduction target, well, the finger's going to be very much pointed at them, and, you know, they will have to put themselves on a course to reach their targets.
More specific questions coming in now. There's a question in from, actually we don't have a name for this question, but they're asking what's going to happen in 2022. I was using protected urea in 2020 and 2021. I've made inquiries in my area and there's no getting any of it for next year. So can I spread urea? Anyone want to take that one up?
Yeah. Do you want?
No, well, go ahead.
Okay, look, I think the fertilizer market is going to be incredibly difficult next year. I hope the supply of protected urea is sorted out. But look, I wouldn't, you know, it's going to be a very unusual market, and I suppose, you know, we're going to have to deal with the peculiarities of a market with, you know, a hugely escalating price of fertilizer and availability being a problem. So look, I very much hope it's available, but you know, I also very much hope that the fertilizer market settles down after 2022 and returns to somewhere of a normal market, and that, you know, the supply chains and all that side of it is sorted out. But I wouldn't kind of judge what will happen next year as being the foretaste of what will happen probably for the rest of the decade.
You want to go
I suppose the very positive point from that question is that the listener, or the viewer, sorry, has used protected urea for 2 years and is committed, sounds like is trying to use it again in 2021. So it would seem to me he's had good experience with it. And the second thing that came across as well, And something that we're very clear on now through our messaging from Teagasc, and I know some of our partners in Signpost are as well, is that the farmer has been in contact with his fertilizer sales agent or local co-op or whatever. And that's very important, I think, even more important this year than in other years, because of the uncertainty in the marketplace. It's very important that the supplier that's supplying with fertilizer knows what you want. So they can go to the marketplace with confidence and place an order to get the product that you want, that you've agreed to take. So it's actually very important that farmers speak to their local co-op, local trading merchant or whatever, to talk about what their fertilizer requirements are for 2022.
Question here about early finishing of beef animals. Will this require a far more intensive system, more fertilizer, more concentrates, more reseeding, and that these may have a negative impact on emissions and biodiversity and water quality rather than improving them?
Yeah. So look, no, that's not the way we want to I suppose, bring the beef systems. I suppose what we're saying is that, with best practice, and that's best practice, we'll say, in our research farms, but also best practice on farmers' farms that we're involved in, or farmers' farms that we're not involved in, that's just a best practice. You can get animals to earlier slaughter weights than the average by, focus on good calf rearing, good grassland management in both grazing seasons for animals, and good animal health, and making good quality silage. And I suppose the thing is to try to keep the animal moving at all times, to avoid these periods of low or slow growth, and get animals to your target slaughter weight faster, not through an intensification of the system, but rather through an optimization of the system.
Okay. A question in from Jimmy. Should farmers that reduce their carbon footprint receive a price premium? I mean, that's something as well that it's almost, as you were saying, it's a society-wide ask.
Yeah.
And the consumers have to play a role in this as well, don't they?
Look, again, it's a really good question. And I would say absolutely yes. Society is sort of saying we want you to change, we want you to produce food that's a lower carbon footprint, and there has to be a value put on that. You know what I mean? So how that value is translated back to farmers is always the hard thing, and we don't seem to have a good mechanism for translating those desires of consumers back to the farm gate price. But look, we've seen very good prices for food this year, for farm produce this year. I'm not saying that's anywhere related at all to climate change or consumers' expectations, but it just shows that the market can bear, I suppose, a higher price paid to the farmer and still have consumers very happy with the product that they're buying in the shop. So I think we have to find ways of showing to consumers that, look, this is happening on farms. This is actually costing farmers a bit more money to produce, or they're taking more care in what they're doing, and this is worth your while paying an extra premium for it. Just the same way that you're going to have to pay in other areas of your life, maybe, if you want the environmental actions that all the surveys show that you want.
But the consumer has become very, very accustomed to cheap food, haven't they?
They have, they have in many ways, I suppose. But look, I think in some ways also consumers' awareness maybe of how their food is produced and their demands on what they want in their food has also changed a lot in the last number of years. And look, I think we're by and large a reasonably affluent society, and I don't think it's a big ask of people to put a small extra premium on that for the people that are involved in the production of it.
And it would certainly help from the Signpost Programme point of view. It would certainly help if our milk processors and meat processors were able to offer an incentive or a premium, because then our advisors could go out and say, if you can make this change, it's going to result in an additional bonus or premium. So it's an added incentive. And price incentives have worked to shift farmer behaviour over the years, whether we talk about, say, milk protein percentage as a bonus payment or milk quality as a penalty. It has been very effective, and I know from talking to some of our partners that their discussions are ongoing to see whether something like that could be introduced, so that it would help motivate farmers to make the changes that are required.
Well, particularly if we see one of the main concerns of a lot of farmers is maintaining profitability. There's another question has come in from Kenneth. Are farmers being unfairly targeted for climate action? What do you think?
Well, look, can I say yes and no to that? I think some of the commentary that kind of has gone on over the last couple of months, and it's almost painting the sector as the real bad boy in the Irish economy in terms of emissions. Like, Ireland has very high agricultural emissions. That's no fault of the farmers of Ireland. That's because we actually have quite a low population density and we have very little heavy industry. So agriculture just happens to make up a big share of our emissions, and that's not a sin or that's not a problem. So look, I think some of the comment has been unfair and maybe not really understanding why our emissions are what they are, and actually that Irish agriculture is very sustainable despite having a big share of national emissions. In terms of the no part of my answer, I suppose the point I'd make is that everything we do in this country, whether it's how we drive around, whether it's how we use electricity in our homes, how we heat our homes, how we run our factories, how we live our lives, how we farm our farms, everything I suppose has to take its share of the heavy load that has to be lifted. So from that point of view, agriculture cannot say this is nothing to do with me. It has to, and I think it is well up for the challenge of actually tackling its emissions.
And if we talk about farmers being unfairly targeted, or I suppose a big part of the Signpost programme is obviously to educate farmers and bring them on a journey with you. But is there enough emphasis being put on educating everybody else as to what's going on in the agricultural sector, and why changes are being made, and also what other changes people outside the agricultural sector can make too? Do you think we're doing enough to educate people outside, beyond the farm gates?
I suppose there's always scope for doing more in that space. I suppose as an organisation, our focus is on supporting farmers. And I suppose we'd be glad to work with other partners to share the stories of what's happening on the Signpost farms with broader society and with Irish consumers.
There have been stories in recent times, Frank, about the massive economic impact meeting these targets will have on rural Ireland. In particular, there's talk of a huge amount of job losses in the farming sector. Are they greatly exaggerated?
Well, look, I think the stories were actually about the huge economic impact of not meeting these targets through efficiencies and technologies, and instead, as people were saying, well, we're going to have to cut the herd. And if we had to cut the national herd, if that was the only solution we had to these targets, well, then there would be a massive economic impact on individual farmers and on rural Ireland. So look, that's what I suppose we're trying to avoid here. And as I said, we see this pathway through efficiency and technology. And some of the measures may cost, and some of the measures may need incentives and so on. But it's a far more palatable and cheaper option. And I think than having to cut the herd. And it's what farmers want to do. Farmers want to farm and produce food. That's essentially why they're in the business. I think the change or the journey we're going on now is that to take more cognizance of the environment as we're doing that, and try to do that in a way that's less impactful on the environment. And that's not to say that what we did in the past was wrong. You can only do what you know at the time. And I suppose 30 years ago, very few of us had ever heard of greenhouse gas emissions. Very few of us knew that methane was a greenhouse gas. So you know what I mean? How could people be aware and be taking account of that when none of us knew about it? But as we know now, as things have changed and we realise the importance of biodiversity, we realise the impact that agriculture can have on water quality and on greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, now we have to farm in a way that's more mindful and more respectful, I suppose, of those impacts that we can have.
Question for both of you from Bill. What areas would you prioritise for farmers for next year, for 2022? I'll come to you first on that, Tom. Give you enough time to think of an answer then, Frank.
For me, I think it's the nutrient use, and I suppose for two reasons, as already alluded to. One, the high price of fertilisers next year absolutely makes it imperative for all farmers to look at what their plans are for fertiliser purchases for 2022. And then allied with that, then, I guess you can't do that without looking at the nutrients that you have on the farm. So the value of what nutrients are in your slurry and how you're going to use it, what fields are going to get it. So to make a careful plan for that. And then also to look at the fertility of the soil and what parts of your farm need P and K and lime. So all those are interconnected. So for me, they would be the three items I would start with on the majority of farms.
And you, Frank?
Look, I would have picked the same ones as well, but the year that's in it, now in 2022 is the year to focus on trying to reduce fertilizer usage and therefore reduce your bill. I suppose in terms of what else, look, I go back to the protected urea. You know what I mean? We could overnight, we could make a very, very big dent in agricultural emissions, and I suppose, change this narrative around agriculture by having a big switch to protected urea. So look, if I'd love, as Tom was said, the message to be going to our fertilizer suppliers and so on, that this is something that Irish farmers want to buy into, and therefore, get the supply chains working in that. I suppose the other thing, just, and it's not maybe, it's maybe more longer term, but is the whole area of hedgerows and woodlands on farms. Like, they don't contribute directly to reducing emissions, but they are going to be very, very important for the future in terms of offsetting emissions from agriculture. And it's the negative end of the balance sheet. We've emissions, but how can we also sequester carbon? And the answer to the question, when's the best time to sow a tree, 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. So things that are going to take a long time maybe to take impact, to start looking at some of those. And I think we could do a lot to enhance the appearance of our farms by maybe planting a few trees or planting a bit of hedgerow, and the impact it can make on I suppose the image of a farm, I think, is important. And I suppose for our dairy farmers as well, the whole area, I think somebody mentioned it earlier, of solar, I think that's going to become a very, very viable option for people that use a lot of energy on their farms, and that's why I say dairy farmers. So the government are talking about bringing in the system where excess energy that you generate gets paid for. And once that happens,
we've been a long time waiting for that to happen.
We've been a long time waiting for it, and the Minister has promised it, I think, by the end of the year or early next year. But if you substitute some of your own energy use at the price that we're going to be paying for electricity next year, and can sell some back into the grid, well, solar suddenly becomes a very viable option, and with a very short payback period. And again, the impact it can make for your neighbours to see that you've put in solar panels, and Johnny or Mary or Joanne or whoever, they're actually conscious of trying to reduce emissions. Great to see. So I think I'd love to see that happening more on farms.
And actually, that's a big part, the impact that it has on your neighbours, and it's if you see it, you'll be it, I suppose. And that's ultimately what Signpost is about. Because for it to work, you need widespread adoption of all these new tools and technologies. How widespread, can you even put a figure on it, to have a really big impact? What percentage of farmers in Ireland need to start adopting even the existing tools and technologies that are available?
Well, if you take two of the technologies that have been mentioned already, protected urea and low emission slurry spreading. So if we have a chance of meeting our reduction targets for agriculture, we need 90% of our slurry spread using low emission slurry spreading, and we need probably 65% of our nitrogen spread as protected urea by the end of the decade, by 2030.
And where are we now, Tom, do you know?
So at the moment on low emission slurry spreading, we're at about 36% of our overall slurry is spread using low emission slurry spreading. It's actually one of the technologies that has had a fantastic adoption rate by farmers over the last probably 4 to 6 years, helped in no small part by the grants available from our Department of Agriculture for farmers to purchase the equipment, because it's a capital investment. The farmer has to put his or her hand in their pocket, but there are grants available. On protected urea, I think we're at somewhere between 5 and 10%, I think is the figure approximately. So we're in terms of, if you look at a kind of a stepwise progression on a linear basis, maybe 5 to 6 or 7% per year, we're probably just about right at the moment, but we need to rapidly accelerate that over the next number of years.
Okay. We have another question has come in from Pat. Can the different agricultural sectors, dairy, beef, sheep, tillage, pigs, can they work together to reduce emissions?
Yeah, well, yes, I believe they can, and I suppose that feeds in my mind anyway, to the whole area of circularity and recycling nutrients. And you heard in one of our video clips from our Signpost tillage farmer in County Wexford, Don Summers, he referenced the fact that he was actually bringing organic manures onto the farm so as to reduce his purchase of chemical fertilizers. So there's an example of a tillage farmer working with a local dairy farmer, and I think you mentioned poultry as well, so a poultry farmer to recycle nutrients generated in another enterprise. So that's one example that I can instance.
Okay,
And another one, just to go back maybe to our first video, our farmer from County Meath, who was a dairy calf to beef farmer and buying his stock now from a small number of local farmers, I think he said. And look, that's an obvious area where dairy and beef farmers can work together, is around the type and quality of the calf that is available for beef farmers to purchase. And I suppose a good calf that's selected using the dairy beef index is the optimum type of a calf for a beef farmer to buy, and that is one maybe that will have the best chance of getting to this target slaughter weight at a slightly younger age. So I think that's another area where we'd love to see more progress being made, and the advent of sex semen, I think on a widespread basis this year or for the next breeding season again is going to be a very positive development in that regard, that hopefully will reduce the number maybe of male dairy calves that are in the system to be either exported or bought locally, and maybe give us more of the beef cross dairy breeds that are the type of calves that farmers want.
We're kind of running out of time now. I suppose a final question would be, would you have any message to people watching this, whether they're signpost farmers, not signpost farmers, other partners in the Signpost programme?
Thanks for the opportunity, because first of all, to the signpost farmers, I'd like to say a very, very big thank you for participating in this programme. We really are grateful for your participation. Hope that you get a lot out of it as well over the coming years. For the partners in it, again, a big thank you. All these things cost money, so we're very, very grateful for the monetary support, but also the support from those processors, be they dairy co-ops or meat processors, and the encouragement that they give to us and give to their suppliers around this. I suppose the message I'd have to everybody is maybe one of hope. This might seem like an extraordinary burden on the sector now, and certainly it's challenging. I don't want to minimise that, but look, I think it's meeting challenges like that makes you stronger, and I think our industry has the chance to actually tackle this problem, to win the admiration of the rest of our citizens here in Ireland for doing that, and to get a head start maybe on competitors in other countries, and to be to really solid evidence that Ireland is a country that produces its food in the best possible system, in the most sustainable way possible, and that's a country where I want to buy my food from. That's what we want people all over the world to be saying, and I think we have a chance of doing that.
Well, we'll end on that positive note, I think, Frank. I'd like to thank Frank and Tom both for joining us for the Signpost interview. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in. And just to remind you, as part of the Signpost General Assembly, there are more webinars tomorrow. Just to remind you to tune in at 10 a.m. There's one on slurry fertilizer use 2022, and at 11:45 carbon storage and methane, a webinar on that. So I'd encourage you all to tune in again tomorrow morning. But thank you all for joining us tonight. Good evening.